Imagine a king, not a tyrant, not a conqueror, but a king renowned for his quiet virtues, his love of agriculture, his devotion to his family, and his unwavering sense of duty. This was George III, King of Great Britain and Ireland, a monarch who, through decades of tumultuous global events, from the American Revolution to the Napoleonic Wars, remained a symbol of steadfastness. He was Farmer George, a man of simple tastes, a dedicated husband to Queen Charlotte, and the father of 15 children. But beneath this placid paternal image, an insidious enemy was stirring. An enemy that would not be vanquished by armies or political maneuvering, but would instead wage a slow, relentless war within his own body and mind, twisting his very essence into something terrifying and profoundly tragic. This is the story of King George III's descent into a heartbreaking madness, a private hell that played out on the public stage of a nation. His reign, the longest of any British monarch before Queen Victoria, was marked by extraordinary challenges. Yet his greatest battle was fought not on the fields of Waterloo or the seas of Trafalgar, but within the confines of his own skull. It was a descent into an abyss of delusion, pain, and sensory deprivation, a journey into the uncharted territories of the human psyche that baffled the finest medical minds of his era and left an indelible scar on the British monarchy. To truly comprehend the scale of this personal catastrophe, we must first understand the man himself. George III ascended the throne in 1760 at the tender age of 22. Unlike his Hanoverian predecessors, he was born and bred in England, fluent in English, and deeply committed to his role. He was a pious, moral man, in an age often characterized by aristocratic excess. He sought to restore dignity to the monarchy, to rule with integrity, and to be a father to his people. His daily routine was almost puritanical. Early rising, regular exercise, plain meals, and evenings spent with his beloved Queen Charlotte and their burgeoning family, often listening to music or reading. He was known for his polite demeanor, his genuine interest in his subjects, and his passion for scientific and agricultural innovation. He was, by all accounts, a fundamentally good man. Yet, even in the early years of his reign, there were whispers, fleeting shadows across his otherwise composed countenance. Brief episodes of ill health, vague abdominal complaints, a certain irritability. These were dismissed as minor ailments, the usual stresses of kingship. No one, least of all the king himself, could have foreseen the grotesque finale that awaited him. The first truly public and alarming manifestation of his illness arrived in the summer of 1788. It began subtly, with symptoms that might initially be mistaken for a severe cold or a touch of indigestion. He complained of stomach pains, a general malaise, and a persistent fever. His pulse became rapid and irregular. But soon, the physical symptoms were overshadowed by something far more unsettling. His behavior grew erratic. He became restless, pacing incessantly, speaking with a rapidity that left his listeners bewildered. His language, usually measured and decorous, grew disjointed, filled with non sequiturs and repetitions. His conversation would suddenly shift from one topic to another, often without warning, tumbling from agricultural improvements to state affairs, then to deeply personal and often inappropriate observations, all delivered with an alarming intensity. Imagine the scene within the royal household at Kew Palace. The king, usually so dignified, now seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. He would talk for hours on end, without pause, his voice growing hoarse, his eyes shining with an unnatural light. He would greet strangers in the corridors, mistaking them for old friends. He would embrace trees in the garden, believing they were his children. There were moments of profound confusion, then sudden bursts of rage directed at his attendants, his family, even his queen. He would attempt to jump out of windows, convinced he could fly. He would physically assault his valets, believing them to be demons. Queen Charlotte, a woman of immense fortitude, found herself caught in a living nightmare. Her husband, the man she loved, the anchor of her life, was transforming before her eyes into a stranger, agitated, tormented, his mind a shattered kaleidoscope. The strain was immense. She grew thin, her face etched with worry, her eyes constantly watchful, fearing what new manifestation of his madness the next hour might bring. The children, particularly the older ones, were horrified, bewildered by their father's shocking decline. The political implications were immediate and dire. Britain was in a fragile state, recovering from the loss of its American colonies, navigating complex European alliances. A mad king meant a rudderless ship of state. The Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, a man of formidable intellect and political acumen, was faced with an unprecedented constitutional crisis. Who would rule if the king was incapacitated? The Prince of Wales, George Augustus Frederick, a profligate and estranged son, saw his opportunity for power, eager to seize the regency. This set the stage for the infamous Regency crisis of 1788–89, a period of intense political maneuvering and backbiting that threatened to tear the fabric of government apart. While politicians debated the future of the monarchy, the king's condition worsened. He suffered from severe abdominal pain, often accompanied by vomiting and dark-colored urine, symptoms that, in hindsight, point strongly towards a diagnosis of acute intermittent porphyria, a genetic metabolic disorder that affects the nervous system and can cause severe psychiatric symptoms. But in the 18th century, such knowledge was centuries away. They saw only madness. The doctors called in were a motley crew, largely operating on theories of humor imbalance or simple brain inflammation. Dr. Richard Warren, the king's physician, was a man of the old school, prescribing purges, emetics, and bloodletting to clear the king's system. Imagine the king, already in agony, subjected to further physical torment, leeches sucking at his skin, vile concoctions forced down his throat to induce vomiting and diarrhea, exacerbating his physical weakness. Then came Dr. Francis Willis. Willis was not a conventional physician. He was a clergyman who ran a private asylum for the insane, and his methods were considered radical, even brutal, by some. He believed in firm control, in breaking the patient's will to restore reason. When Willis arrived, the king was in a terrible state, physically debilitated, mentally deranged. Willis's approach was a stark contrast to the deferential treatment the king had always received. He treated the king not as a monarch, but as a patient to be managed, subdued, and, if necessary, restrained. Under Willis's supervision, the king was subjected to a regime of harsh physical restraint. When he grew violent or agitated, he would be bound in a straitjacket or confined to a special chair with restraints that prevented him from moving. Imagine the king, the most powerful man in the world, once capable of commanding nations, now reduced to being tied down, struggling against his bonds, his incoherent cries echoing through the royal apartments. Willis's method, while shocking, was rooted in a belief that physical coercion could force a disordered mind back into alignment. He would sit close to the king, challenging his delusions, trying to force him to acknowledge reality. Sometimes he would even physically confront the king, holding him down or shouting at him. One particularly vivid account comes from Fanny Burney, a celebrated novelist and courtier, whose diary entries provide an invaluable, if harrowing, glimpse into the king's condition. She describes his incoherence, his restlessness, his perpetual motion, his loud, though indistinct, utterance. She writes of how he would seize her hand, talk of his own sorrows and sufferings, and then pivot abruptly to a nonsensical declaration, leaving her stupefied with terror. She witnessed the moments when his reason seemed utterly lost, his eyes staring with a painful, unmeaning glare, his voice raised to a pitch of frightful loudness. The sounds from the king's apartments were often chilling. The ceaseless, rapid, fire monologues, the sudden shouts, the occasional thud of a body struggling against restraints, the desperate pleas of attendants. The atmosphere was one of profound sadness and barely contained chaos. The once meticulous king, known for his neatness, was often disheveled, his hair unkempt, his clothes stained from the violent retching and purging. The royal chamber, once a sanctuary, became a place of profound suffering, filled with the faint, sickly scent of illness and the metallic tar, nung of blood from his various physical ailments and treatments. Yet, amidst this terrifying descent, there were moments, fleeting, heartbreaking moments, of lucidity. The king would suddenly recognize Queen Charlotte, his mind briefly clearing from the fog of illness, only to be plunged back into darkness seconds later. These glimpses of his former self were perhaps the most painful for his family, offering a cruel glimmer of hope before snatching it away. Miraculously, or so it seemed at the time, in February 1789, the king began to recover. The frantic talking subsided, the delusions lessened, and he slowly regained his composure. By March, he was well enough to appear in public, attending a service at Windsor Chapel, where the spontaneous outpouring of national joy and relief was immense. Bells rang, bonfires blazed, and Thanksgiving services were held across the country. Pitt's government was saved, and the Prince of Wales was returned to the wings. The nation rejoiced, attributing the recovery to the prayers of the people and the efficacy of Dr. Willis's controversial treatments. The exact reasons for the recovery, however, were not understood. It was simply the episodic nature of his underlying condition. For a period of more than a decade, King George III enjoyed relatively good health. He continued his duties, rode his horses, indulged his passion for collecting books, and remained a popular figure. The horrors of 1788-89 seemed like a distant nightmare, an isolated incident. But the genetic predisposition for porphyria, if that indeed was the cause, did not vanish. It lay dormant, a silent, ticking clock, waiting for stress, medication, or diet to trigger another attack. The early 19th century brought renewed strains. The escalating Napoleonic Wars, the fragile Peace of Amiens, and the mental burden of governing a nation at war all contributed to the king's vulnerability. In 1801, another significant bout of illness struck. The symptoms were frighteningly familiar: rapid-fire speech, irrationality, and sleeplessness. This time, the episode was linked to the political crisis over Catholic emancipation, a measure the king felt he could not support without violating his coronation oath. His moral convictions, so deeply ingrained, became a source of immense personal conflict and, perhaps, a trigger for his illness. This bout was less severe than the first, and he recovered, though the period left him visibly shaken. Another came in 1804, prompted by the death of his youngest daughter, Princess Amelia. Each recurrence eroded a little more of the king's mental resilience, leaving him more fragile, more susceptible to the next devastating wave. The intervals between attacks grew shorter, the recovery periods less complete. The shadow of madness was no longer a temporary cloud, but a persistent presence. The final, and ultimately irreversible, descent began in 1810. This time, the trigger was the death of his beloved youngest daughter, Princess Amelia. Amelia was a gentle soul, frail and suffering from tuberculosis. The king doted on her, visiting her bedside frequently, offering comfort and prayers. Her suffering deeply affected him, and her death in November 1810 shattered his already precarious mental state. He succumbed to a profound and enduring grief that quickly spiraled into full-blown derangement. The symptoms returned with a vengeance, far more severe and prolonged than any previous episode. His sleep became non-existent. He would talk incessantly, sometimes for 58 hours without a break, his voice growing hoarse and his throat raw. His speech was a torrent of words, a jumble of prayers, laments, and delusions. He believed he was King David from the Old Testament, sometimes communicating directly with angels, other times issuing royal decrees to his imaginary biblical court. He would spend hours playing the harpsichord, his fingers dancing across the keys, often in the middle of the night, sometimes singing hymns, other times speaking to those long dead. The physical decay mirrored the mental. His eyesight began to fail, a symptom consistent with porphyria's neurological effects. By 1811, he was virtually blind. Soon after, his hearing deteriorated significantly, leaving him almost entirely deaf. He was now imprisoned within himself, a world of darkness and silence, punctuated only by the terrifying voices of his own mind. His attendants, a rotating guard of physicians and equerries, found their task increasingly harrowing. The king, once so meticulous, became physically unkempt, his beard growing long, his hair matted. He would wander the royal apartments in a disoriented state, often half-dressed. There were moments of agitation when he would try to escape, or lash out with surprising strength, requiring multiple attendants to restrain him. The royal household, once a bustling center of court life, became a mausoleum of sorrow, filled with the sounds of the king's tormented cries and the hushed whispers of his terrified family. Queen Charlotte, now in her 60s, was heartbroken. She could no longer bear to be in his presence for extended periods. The sight of his suffering, the sound of his incoherent ramblings, were too painful. She would watch him from afar, her eyes filled with tears, mourning the loss of the man she had loved for half a century. Their children, the Prince Regent foremost among them, were deeply affected. The prince, who had once plotted to seize power, now found himself burdened with the full responsibility of governing a nation at war, while his father lingered in a twilight world. He would sometimes visit, but the interactions were strained, awkward, and profoundly sad. The king rarely recognized him. The king's diet became erratic. He would sometimes refuse food for days, convinced it was poisoned. Other times, he would devour meals ravenously, his table manners long forgotten. His bowels became a source of constant distress, suffering from severe constipation, a common porphyria symptom. The attempts to relieve this often involved invasive and painful procedures, adding to his torment. The nation watched, helpless. There was no cure, no understanding. The royal physicians, still operating on antiquated theories, could only offer symptomatic relief, which often amounted to further physical torment. They applied blistering agents to his skin to draw out impurities. They gave him strong sedatives that dulled his senses even further, plunging him into a deeper stupor, or volatile chemicals like tartar emetic to induce violent vomiting. The treatments were almost as barbaric as the illness itself, turning the king's body into a battlefield, his mind a besieged fortress. His attendants often resorted to deception to manage him. They would bring him false dispatches from parliamentary sessions, or fictional reports from his beloved farms at Windsor. He would listen intently, offering comments and advice, believing himself to still be the fully functioning monarch, signing imaginary documents. It was a tragic charade, played out daily by weary, devoted staff who understood the futility of it all, but clung to the fragile hope that this would somehow soothe him. One of the most poignant descriptions of his state comes from a contemporary account by Lord Eldon, the Lord Chancellor, who visited the king in 1811. Eldon described the king playing a tune on the harpsichord, then abruptly changing to a prayer, ending with a passionate interjection. Eldon felt his own sanity wavering in the king's presence, so unhinged and unsettling was the scene. Yet amidst the chaos, Eldon also witnessed flashes of the king's old self, a momentary glimmer of recognition, a familiar turn of phrase, a spark of his inherent goodness. These moments were like pinpricks of light in an otherwise encompassing darkness, just enough to remind those around him of the profound loss. The years between 1811 and his death in 1820 were a long, agonizing twilight. The king became almost completely isolated from the outside world. He was blind, deaf, and increasingly frail. His once sharp intellect had dissolved into a perpetual state of delirium and confusion. He would sing hymns, often "God Save the King," for hours, his voice thin and reedy. He would often speak to himself, or to his deceased daughter Amelia, or to long-dead figures like William Pitt. He lived in his own private universe, a prisoner of his mind, completely detached from the momentous events unfolding beyond the walls of Windsor Castle, where the Napoleonic Wars raged and Britain asserted its global dominance. His physical state continued to deteriorate. His body was racked with pain, and open sores developed from his various physical ailments, including erysipelas and what were likely the lingering effects of porphyria on his skin. The once robust farmer George was reduced to a shriveled, helpless figure, ravaged by disease and neglect. The stench of his illness, of bodily fluids and unwashed skin, became a constant companion in his chamber, a grotesque sensory testament to his decline. For those who loved him, it was a living death. Queen Charlotte remained devoted, but the toll on her health was immense. She herself began to decline, never fully recovering from the grief and strain of her husband's protracted suffering. She passed away in 1818, leaving George III even more isolated in his final years. He remained unaware of her death, lost in his own world, still calling out her name, still believing she was merely in another room. The final years were a protracted agony. Confined largely to his rooms at Windsor Castle, the king would sometimes thrash wildly, requiring his attendants to strap him into his bed or chair. At other times, he would sit perfectly still for hours, humming softly, his eyes blank, staring into nothingness. The once grand and active monarch became a specter, a shell of his former self, a living monument to the devastating power of illness. On the 29th of January, 1820, at the age of 81, after nearly a decade of living in his own isolated world of darkness and delusion, King George III finally died at Windsor Castle. His death was less a dramatic event and more a quiet cessation, the last flicker of a candle that had been burning down for years. The long, tormented reign had ended. In the aftermath of his death, the medical community and historians began to grapple with the mystery of his illness. For generations, it was simply referred to as madness, an inexplicable malady that had plagued a good king. But in the mid-20th century, new theories emerged. Building on research into the king's personal letters, diaries, and medical records, two British psychiatrists, Ida McAlpine and Richard Hunter, put forth a compelling case. King George III suffered from acute intermittent porphyria. Their research meticulously detailed how the king's symptoms, the reddish-purple urine, the abdominal pain, the rapid pulse, the insomnia, the profound neurological and psychiatric disturbances, all aligned perfectly with the known manifestations of porphyria. Furthermore, they found evidence of the disease in his ancestors and descendants, suggesting a genetic link. The intermittent nature of his attacks, with periods of remission, also fit the pattern of acute intermittent porphyria. This posthumous diagnosis transforms our understanding of King George III's suffering. It was not a moral failing, not simply madness in the traditional sense, but a cruel and painful metabolic disorder that systematically attacked his nervous system, his brain, and his body. The harsh treatments he endured, the purges, the emetics, the blistering, the restraints, were not only ineffective but likely exacerbated his condition, as certain medications can trigger or worsen porphyria attacks. The king was being poisoned and tormented, not by malevolent forces, but by the very hands trying to cure him, born out of medical ignorance. The story of King George III's descent into madness is more than a historical footnote. It is a profound human tragedy. It reveals the terrifying vulnerability of even the most powerful individuals to the ravages of illness. It exposes the limitations of 18th century medicine and the often brutal approaches taken in the absence of understanding. It highlights the immense personal cost of duty and the devastating impact of chronic illness on families. From the dutiful young monarch who sought to rule with integrity, to the blind, deaf, and deluded old man singing hymns in a darkened room, George III's life was a testament to both human endurance and human suffering. His madness forced a nation to confront uncomfortable truths about succession, mental health, and the very nature of power. It reminds us that behind every historical figure, every grand narrative, lies a complex, often heartbreaking human story. A story of flesh and blood, of mind and spirit, battling against forces often far beyond their control. His reign was long, his legacy immense, but perhaps his most enduring lesson lies in the silent, agonizing battle he fought within himself, a deeply private horror played out on the grand stage of history.